When the president announced his recent executive orders, there was a flood of activity on social media. Now, at this point, neither side really knew what was in those orders, but that didn't prevent people from commenting. And it was very quickly clear that the two sides had such a different perspective that it was hard to believe they were watching the same event. On the one hand, there were a lot of people that were very moved by the president's speech. It's an emotional subject, and the speech was really very, very well delivered, so it's hard to blame them. It's also worth noting that not all of these executive orders are bad for gun owners. On the other hand, a lot of gun owners familiar with recent talking points favored by gun control proponents heard much of those same things again. And hearing these misleading points reiterated lends one a cynical perspective that makes it hard to take tears as genuine. Now, I've addressed most of these talking points already in previous videos, and many of them have been thoroughly and consistently debunked even by the likes of the Washington Post, the AP, CNN, and even the New York Times. Now, that information is out there, so I'm going to try to focus mainly on the executive orders and the justifications that Obama used. The first group of orders concerns background checks. The president said, a violent felon can buy the exact same weapon over the internet with no background check and no questions asked. This is typical of what we hear from proponents of background checks and characterizes the misunderstanding that the public has concerning the current law regarding background checks. The current law already requires a background check for any dealer sale, regardless of where it takes place, whether in a shop, over the internet, or at a gun show. It also requires background checks for sales between private parties that occur across state lines. This has been the law for more than 20 years. Under the current law, the only type of firearms sale that does not require a background check is an in-person sale between two private parties. And even then, it's illegal to sell a gun to someone who you have reason to believe may be prohibited. Now, these executive orders doesn't change any of that at all. What the order does do is lower the threshold to where a private seller has to get a federal firearms license and become a dealer. Now, why would gun owners object to that? Well, some don't. And in an ironic twist, Bill Clinton had moved to raise that same threshold, to get rid of what he called kitchen table gun dealers. He felt that that would lower illegal sales. Of course it didn't. And bringing that threshold back down won't either. The primary objection to this action is the vagueness of the law. This is a direct quote from the ATF's newly published guideline on the subject. I'm going to read it so I get it right. Federal law does not establish a bright line rule for when a federal firearms license is required. As a result, there is no specific threshold, number, or frequency of sales, quantity of firearms, or amount of profit or time invested that triggers the license requirements. Instead, determining whether you are engaged in the business of dealing a firearm requires looking at the specific facts and circumstances of your activities. Now, they further point out that as few as 2 sales could trigger that threshold. In other words, they're unable to define who needs a license, but they'll know it when they see it. And they can enforce it after the fact with fines and prison terms. Now, you can see how this could concern any gun owner who may sell a firearm for a variety of reasons. Maybe to improve their collection in a trade. Maybe because they don't like or need that particular firearm anymore. Or maybe they just need a little cash. With such vague guidance, it makes it impossible to know whether a transaction will be considered legal or not. Now, it has no effect on illicit illegal sales, but it makes it hard for someone who's trying to remain law-abiding to stay above the law. The next section concerns National Firearm Act's controlled items, such as antique fully automatic guns, suppressors, and short-barreled rifles or shotguns. Now, for those of you who don't know, these items were essentially banned in 1935, but if a company, an individual, or a trust would like to own them, they can pay a $200 tax, go through some extra scrutiny, and basically acquire permission to own them from the ATF. Now, the order makes some changes to the way this application is made. Specifically, those in a trust will now have to submit fingerprints and a photo for each trustee when they make their application, where they didn't before. However, individual applicants have always had to do this. On the other hand, individual applicants will no longer have to get permission from their chief law enforcement officer, which is usually a sheriff or a chief of police. Now, this is a good thing for those seeking NFA items because many sheriffs and chiefs of police would, regardless of the eligibility of the applicant, simply refuse to sign any forms, denying people access to those. And this will no longer be the case. Now, trusts and individuals will simply have to notify their chief law enforcement officer of the application being made. So this order is really a mixed bag for those seeking NFA items. Now, one other note, the President implied that criminals get NFA registered items through trusts, and that simply isn't true. I personally couldn't find any record of that ever happening, and NFA registered firearms are almost never used in crime. So again, this order does absolutely nothing to reduce gun crime. Next is an order to ensure that states submit full criminal backgrounds to the National Instant Background Check System. Now, this order literally does nothing. All it amounts to is a memo from the Justice Department sent out to the states that reiterates the current law. And the last group of orders is aimed at making the National Instant Background Check System more efficient by hiring more than 200 new ATF officers to run them, modernizing the system, and making the system available 24/7. Well, great. I'm all for it. You know, firearm sales have been hitting record highs nearly every month, and more system capacity is sorely needed to process all those background checks. As a recent University of Chicago study pointed out, only a negligible number of criminals acquire their guns through non-illicit private sales. And of course, it's ridiculous to think that someone involved in illicit sales would run down to the local shop for a background check or apply for a federal firearms license. So while these orders are a mixed bag for gun owners, what's very clear is none of them do anything to prevent or reduce gun crime.